am the composer and poet Andrew Lloyd Fry, and today I wanted to talk about the term indie classical. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is I feel like it's a little bit of a confusing term, and I think there's actually two different things that people mean when they say that term. So I just kind of wanted to clarify those two different definitions of the word and just kind of explore that. So the first definition is more of like a structure, organization, kind of like how the music is being created and released and put into the world. And the second one, I feel like, is more of a genre, style, musical value type of word. So let's talk about the first one. Now, this is the kind of like structure of indie classical and what that means and how the music's being released and shared with people. That's the definition of the word that I prefer. I feel like it's clear cut. I feel like it's exciting, and that would be a little bit more how I would use the word. So let's talk about that first one. So in the 2000s, kind of all art went through a huge, and maybe not to say all art, maybe to say music. It's really clearly with music. There would be a lot of application to other fields, but we'll be specific to music. Went through a huge decentralization process, and technology was the main thing that made that decentralizing possible. And before, there was very clear gatekeepers into the industry, and those a large part would be labels. There would be other ones, and you kind of just had to wait and get accepted by one person who happened to like you, and that would be kind of like you're in. And the internet technology just kind of started to completely break that down, where it's like somebody can make a music video at home with a $0 budget and they can connect with an audience. Recording equipment became a lot cheaper. Just the way to connect with an audience through streaming became very easy. And it's like all of these things took out the middleman. So between the creator and the audience, there wasn't like a person who would say yes or no. And it was just kind of like the creator to the audience. And it's like that just happened in all the genres of music except classical music. So classical music has a very rigid system of a grant system, of winning competitions, and that gatekeeper model is extremely strong. And going back to what this video is about, indie classical, I think at its simplest, it's like, how can classical music exist with a new structure behind the music that is not dependent on a board or a gatekeeper or this non-audience middleman who will say, yes, you can be a part of the concert, or yes, this project can happen and I'll give you the money because I happen to like it or whatever. So indie classical, finding creative ways to connect with an audience without that really strong gatekeeper model, which I think is really exciting, and I think it's really, really healthy. And I think actually classical music, for its like health, really needs that. So when we have one person or a board of people deciding what the audience will like, deciding what's artistically valuable, that's bad. And they're picking what they personally like, which that's what I would do if I was in that situation. But when you're so in the system, when you're so wrapped up in that, that's not going to be like you're the best person to choose for the rest of us. I could go deep in a rabbit hole on this one. So let's talk about like some ways that this independence can happen. So a lot of it would boil down to money and why classical music, everything else has kind of like accepted this like a little bit more of a DIY aesthetic, and classical music hasn't. And classical music's really expensive, so it's been really hard for classical music to like go with everyone else on that journey, and it's kind of like we're frozen in our little like grant competition competitive system. So if you want to circumvent that system, you have to do a couple things. You could be independently wealthy, which that's helpful. That's probably not a good solution for most people. And here's the main solution. You need to bring down the cost of creating and sharing music. Really simple. So, indie classical would probably lean a lot more towards small, like chamber music, not symphonic music, because it's cheaper. It would lean more towards composers also being performers, and it's like really practically, most composers can play an instrument. Okay, I can show up and do something and have a zero cost performer instead of, spending $1,000 or, depending on whatever the thing is. I think home recording, which is not that, there's just not much precedent for that in classical music. Recording things yourself, establishing your own concerts. There's just all of these ways where we're circumventing the system. Now, there's two actually historical precedents for this, and we probably wouldn't look back and say like, oh, that was indie classical, but you can see how they're like circumventing the kind of system. And both of these are new movements that were not very accepted like in large. So the first one is 12-tone. I'm trying to think. I don't know. Yeah, I know Schoenberg, Webern. I assume there was more involved, but there was a season where they were putting on essentially house shows, and those, they had like, I don't know, they probably in mansions. I think it was still kind of posh, but it's just like, hey, we're not accepted here. So we're kind of just gonna like go do our own thing, and they were doing concerts in the home. The more potent one is actually early minimalism, Steve Reich and Philip Glass, and they assembled their own groups. They paid for their own recordings. They started touring. There's no way we would hear of either of those composers if they had just tried to like plug in to classical music. And it's like, hey, I wrote music for 18 musicians. Does anybody want to play this? It's just like, no, nobody would have ever done that. And they just started connecting with audiences. The other thing is they the doors weren't open as far as classical spaces. So it's like, okay, we'll go to the art gallery. We'll go, did a lot of concerts in New York lofts. So that kind of just like paints the picture of circumventing this really rigid system that I think is actually really, really bad for classical music, really detrimental, and one of the reasons, like, one of the biggest problems of classical music today. Okay, so that's the first one, kind of the structure. Now, there's this other definition that I think is more genre, and this gets a little more hazy, and this gets a little more tricky to talk about. And I would say, again, I'm much more like, this is how I would use the word, not this like genre thing, but I think it is an element when this word is used. So, at its simplest, so indie, let's talk about indie first. So indie is short for independent. So this first definition, we're very much leaning on the term independent classical. indie is also a kind of like subculture of like rock pop music that may or may not be independent, but it kind of took on like a aesthetic and a style and took on certain like musical value characteristics. And I think sometimes when we're talking about indie classical, we're actually talking about some kind of blend of those two worlds. And I think one of the reasons that's kind of become a thing is there's so many, or there's a good handful, let's put it this way, of indie musicians who are crossing over into classical music and classical that are crossing over into indie. So like I would say the prime example of this is Bryce Dessner, who is the guitarist for the National. He's a trained classical composer, and he's, you know, clearly has his foot in both worlds. Now, there's things that he does that feel a little bit more like a blend of those two worlds, and that comes through in the music. And there's things that he does that are just like, okay, this feels like clearly that, or you know, off somewhere else. Clearly kind of like the National doesn't feel very classical. So that would be one. Richard Reed Parry of Arcade Fire wrote a series of works called Music for Heart and Breath. And, you know, he's a indie rock guitarist writing classical music. So there's going to be some of that influence, you know, without even trying in the things he writes. Ryan Lott of Sunlux has composed a bit, specifically what I'm aware of for ymusic, which we'll come back to them. My Brightest Diamond is a classically trained vocalist. She's done some work that's more in that classical vocal range. She's written some music for ymusic. Nico Muhley is a classical composer who's been very involved in kind of the indie world. So he's done arrangements for Jonesy. He's done arrangements for Grizzly Bear. He did Planetarium, which was with Sufjan, Bryce Dessner, and James McAllister. So, you know, you can kind of see how like these worlds are getting entangled. Oh, St. Vincent, that's another one. She's written music for ymusic. Let's talk about ymusic for a second. So they're a chamber ensemble, and they're kind of in that like both world thing. So they've been kind of like the chamber ensemble for pop musicians. I think they've worked with Paul Simon, Sufjan Stevens. They were on Music for Heart and Breath. And, you know, Sufjan has composed for them. Ryan Lott of Sunlux, My Brightest Diamond, St. Vincent. Like, they've all written works for that ensemble. So you can see kind of these worlds are blending. And I would say, if you kind of take a step back, there can be kind of like an aesthetic musical value that's created in if we're talking about like indie classical as a genre. And I would say kind of some of the tendencies of those, and this is, yeah, we're just like broad stroke, is I would say almost all of those people would look at minimalism as a like pillar in what they do. And whether they're minimalist or not, like all of those people I think would say like that music is in my music and it's important. I would say there can be a rhythm feel in that music that's not that's not in classical music very much, and it's really common in everything else, and that a little bit more of like rhythmic drive. Just like it can have some of that. There was one other thing. I mean, both of those would kind of, that music can just have this like pop element without being pop music. So again, this one gets harder to like latch down what is indie classical as a genre, but kind of talking around it, I think you can kind of get a picture of of what I'm saying. Okay, well that is it for this video. Appreciate you watching.